My fiance HP and I own 17 vehicles, and of those 17 vehicles, 13 of them are rental cars that are rented out on the peer-to-peer car sharing platform Turo. And of those 13 cars, none of them have been financed, meaning all of them have been paid for in cash. And one question that I get asked all the time is the question of, why do I pay for my cars in cash? Why don't I finance my Turo cars, keep my cash on hand, and use somebody else's money to grow my wealth? So in today's video, I'm going to be addressing that exact same question, and I'm going to be breaking down why I've chosen to pay cash for all of my Turo cars. I'm going to be talking about my thought process, the pros and cons of financing cars, and some of the things that I think you should keep in mind. So let's get started. Now, one thing I would like to note before we dig in is the fact that up until very recently, I did have a Maserati Ghibli that was financed. This was a car that cost $29,500. We financed it with 0% down, and we had a monthly payment of about $600 per month. Now, the reason why we financed that car is because of the fact that it was a $30,000 car, and we didn't want to tie up $30,000 in cash for the sake of getting one high-end luxury car for our fleet. So I just wanted to mention that because it would be a lie if I said that I've never financed a car before, but of the dozens of cars that I've owned over the years, that is the only one that I financed for the purpose of renting it on Turo. Now, with that out of the way, let's first dig into why I've chosen to not finance for the sake of growing my Turo fleet. Then after that, I'm going to talk about what are some of the things that you need to keep in mind if you want to finance. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some of the exceptions where financing really does make sense. So the number one reason as to why I've decided not to finance cars really comes down to the fact that the types of cars I buy are not easily financeable cars. I buy cars that are low-end economy cars, so things like Ford Focuses, Mazda 2s, Mazda 3s, Toyota Yaris's, really any car that's priced at $6,000 or below, that is like my bread and butter. The problem is that conventional car loans don't really cover cars like that. They don't cover cars that are 10, 11 years old that cost under $6,000. So if you wanted to finance this type of car, you either would have to go for like an alternative route, like a credit union in some cases, though even that success rate is very up in the air, or alternatively, you'd have to go to these like smaller third-party dealerships. And traditionally speaking, these types of dealerships have really bad terms with high interest rates and just they aren't a good deal. In general, the types of cars I buy just simply don't make sense to finance them. I would much rather pay $5,000 cash and own the car outright rather than have to tie myself up in the paperwork and the cost of getting a loan for financing this type of car. So the number one reason as to why I don't finance really comes down to the fact that my business model just simply doesn't make sense for this. The types of car I buy, the price point I buy them at, and where I buy my cars really doesn't facilitate the act of financing very well. On that exact same note is the fact that whenever I'm looking for cars to buy, oftentimes it's kind of an impulse decision. For example, last week I bought a Toyota Yaris and I was skimming through Facebook Marketplace as I was eating my lunch. I found a Toyota Yaris that I liked. I sent the owner an offer, he accepted it, and then I went out and bought that car about an hour later. This was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon by the time I bought it. It was something that was completely unexpected. It was not prompted. It was something I just stumbled upon. And by paying in cash, it makes it really easy to buy these cars without really planning to buy one. It allows for me the flexibility to buy a car the second I find one that's a good deal without having to logistically plan the process of buying it. If I was having to get a loan for every single car I bought, it would just make the entire process of buying a car logistically more difficult. Another key reason as to why I don't finance cars is the fact that I have always been uncomfortable with the idea of financing a car for a business model and platform that I don't control. Now, I love Turo. I love renting cars on Turo. I love the car sharing economy. I think that it's one of the best ways to grow your wealth quickly. And I've talked about this a lot on this channel. But one thing that I've always been nervous about with Turo, or really any platform that facilitates peer-to-peer sharing, is the fact that no matter how much money you make with that platform, no matter how many cars or assets you have getting rented out, you will never own the platform itself. Turo will always be in control. So because of that, you will never have 100% control of your money. And this is a big downside. This is one of the reasons why I've never depended on Turo for 100% of my income. Even before YouTube, I had other income sources that I relied on in conjunction with Turo because I was never comfortable with the idea of relying 100% of my income on a platform that I don't own nor control. Whenever it comes to cash cars, if Turo was to disappear tomorrow, I could simply sell my cars, move on, and probably buy some real estate. But if Turo was to close down tomorrow and you had dozens of financed cars, you're in a really tough spot. And this is something that many hosts saw in 2020 whenever the pandemic hit. Hosts that had their cars financed were in a really tough spot for a couple of months, while hosts that had paid cash for their cars and didn't have expensive monthly payments were in a really good spot where they could just simply sit and wait for the dust to settle. The same goes for anything that could happen with Turo. Nothing with Turo is guaranteed. Your profile could be deactivated for one reason or another. Turo could go bankrupt in 20 years. Turo could disappear, could be bought out, could change their structure. I'm not going to say any of those things are going to happen, but they certainly could. And if you're somebody that has dozens of financed vehicles or even a handful of financed vehicles, I simply worry that you're putting yourself in an unnecessary amount of risk. Because of that, I've always been a proponent of controlling what you can with Turo. And whenever it comes to over leveraging yourself and taking out debt for the sake of a Turo business, that's an aspect that you can control. And it's something that I've always been very uncomfortable with. Because of that, I've opted to buy all of my cars in cash. That way, if something was to happen, I'm not over leveraged with debt. I can always just sell my cars and move on to the next thing. So those are the main reasons as to why I avoid financing. And if I'm being honest, it really is the first reason that I spoke about, which is that my cars that I buy simply aren't financeable cars. They're older, they're cheaper, they're not really great to finance. But now let's dive into some of the exceptions to this rule, because I do think that in some cases, financing a car does make sense. Now, the first exception to this rule is if you're somebody who is tight on cash. Now, I acknowledge the fact that I'm in a pretty fortunate position. I make good money and I have money coming in from a lot of different places. This allows for me the ability to buy cash cars whenever I want to. This, of course, wasn't always the case for me, and I'm sure for many of you, it's not the case for you as well. If you're somebody who wants to get involved with Turo, but you simply don't have $5,000 lying around, then I think financing your first vehicle, or even in some cases, financing your first 2 vehicles could be an okay route to pursue. But of course, if you choose this route, make sure to choose cars that you can afford with or without Turo. Make sure that you aren't over leveraging yourself with debt, and make sure that you choose cars that aren't going to depreciate at a crazy high rate. If you choose to pursue this route, then I think financing your first car or even your second car and then using the revenue and profits from those cars to then save up for a cash car could be a really great route to pursue. In fact, that's very similar to what I did with my very first car. My very first car that I listed on Turo was a financed Jeep Wrangler. It was my personal car that I didn't enjoy driving. I decided to list it on Turo. I then made money from that Jeep. I used the profits to buy a Toyota Yaris. I rinsed and repeated that entire process until I had enough cash on hand to buy used cars whenever I needed them. The second exception to the financing rule is if you're buying an expensive car. And this is really what my thought process was whenever I purchased my Maserati Ghibli. You see, it makes sense to spend $5,000 on a cash flowing vehicle, but it doesn't really make sense to buy a $30,000 or $40,000 car in cash because that is tying up a ton of money. So if you're somebody who is wanting to buy a higher end vehicle to list on Turo, then that is definitely one of the cases where I would look to finance instead of paying for it in cash. In my case, it was a Maserati Ghibli, but if you're looking to finance a $30,000 SUV or a $40,000 Porsche or whatever the case is, then looking to finance that car could definitely be a smart move. But if you're going to go this route, then make sure that you're going to be cash flow positive with this car. So you'll want to make sure that the money that you make on Turo will not only cover the monthly payments, it will also cover potential depreciation once it comes time to sell that car. It'll also cover increased insurance costs and, of course, your regular maintenance and repairs. With that being said, you guys, I hope that this gave you some insight into my thought process with financing. I definitely have had a little bit of a pivot over the years. I think like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I was like very anti-finance. I thought that it was always a bad idea, regardless of the context. But over the years, I've definitely changed my point of view. I'm definitely not a proponent of financing, but I do think that it has its time and place. And I think as long as you finance a car below market value, you'll be setting yourself up for success. Of course, taking these other components into play as as well. If you guys have any questions or comments, or if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.